All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and begin. Let me welcome everyone to the virtual Mershon Center and the latest offering of the American Foreign and Military Policy Cluster. On behalf of my co-leaders in the cluster, Jennifer Siegel and Rick Herman, as well as the director of the Mershon Center, Chris Jelpe. Welcome. Today we have with us Juliette Kayyem, who is the Senior Belfer Lecturer in International Security at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she is faculty chair of the Homeland Security and Global Health projects. She is also the author of Security Mom, a memoir that explores the intersection and commonalities of her life in Homeland Security and her life as a mother. Maybe she'll talk a little bit more about that. It sounds pretty interesting. She appears frequently on CNN as their on-air national security analyst. Most recently, she was President Obama's Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security, where she did a variety of things, but among them, she played a pivotal role in major operations, including the handling of the H1N1 pandemic, the pandemic before the current one. She has also organized major policy efforts in critical infrastructure protection and community resiliency. And today she is going to both speak about and lead a discussion on the future of pandemic prevention in the United States. Juliette, welcome to the virtual Mershon Center, and the virtual floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, we're used to this now. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you all for joining today. I'm really looking forward to a discussion about the road ahead and what this all means. So what I thought I would do for just a little bit at the beginning is talk a little bit about this intersection of Homeland Security response, which is essentially what we're in right now with COVID, and its dynamics with national security. In other words, the more traditional foreign policy, national security issues, and why I think that's relevant for thinking about the road ahead. So the first thing to think about are sort of the different ways in which general public health threats uniquely impact a nation's national security, right? So because we tend to think of sort of public health as different, right? It's the doctors, and then you think of national security or foreign policy as the diplomats or the military or the spies, sometimes the lawyers. And there's like this intersection now that we're living, that we certainly know we're living in a global pandemic. So the different kinds of threats that we worry about around sort of public health threats and national security fall into sort of 7 different camps. I'm just going to list them out, but I just thought it would be helpful to see sort of the broad range than just COVID, right? So that COVID will end, and hopefully end sooner than we think, but there's going to be other things, of course, down the pipeline. The first is, don't forget, bioterrorism, which was one of our biggest fears, in particular man-made bioterrorism and pathogens that would create public health dangers undetected, released, say, at a major sporting event when we used to go to sporting events. The second is the idea or the reality that we're experiencing now of emerging infectious disease threats. And it wasn't just COVID-19, SARS, MERS, Ebola, influenza virus, which comes around every year. And then, of course, COVID-19, all are emerging infectious diseases that are impacting each country's national security. I'm going to get into sort of how it's impacting the US's national security. The third is that global public health threats and public health threats generally will have an impact on global trade, travel, and commerce, right? So we are isolated as a nation, literally, like we can't travel anywhere. And our trade is impacted, supply chains, travel. And you can look at China's Q3, the third, China and having now isolated COVID, lots of problems with China in terms of disclosures and stuff like that, but has managed to contain COVID, has a strong testing capability. And now if you look at their economy in Q3, if you think of national security as a battle of economies as well, we're losing, they're winning, right? I mean, it's like this, like obvious. So you just look at these numbers. The fourth is to think about also the disinformation that's out there. Many of you probably follow this world a lot, but disinformation that's telling us that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, that counters the evidence, that counters the evidence-based measures to control an outbreak or threat. So it is that the vaccine is, will kill your children or something like that. These are disinformation plays that countries like that, Russia and others that want to see us not strong, are playing in the national security arena. The fifth is cyber terrorism and cybersecurity breaches. Lots of data and privacy data is being held by the government now about us and our health. We have senior leaders, including the President of the United States, who got sick. We do worry about these cyber terrorism and cybersecurity breaches related to health security and how they can be utilized by foreign governments for blackmail, for intelligence manipulation, and other issues like that. So you can see how all of a sudden this becomes a big deal. Like, this is not just about the disease and how it's killing us, but about our national security. I don't want you to forget about forest protection. Our military, think about the Secret Service. Our military has been impacted, the Navy, obviously, in the early days. Our ability to exert military strength has been impacted. We don't know the exact numbers from the Pentagon, but we certainly know that in the early days, at least, we were taking, a not insignificant amount of our fleet offline. And forest protection is part of our national security, right? We need to protect our troops, and think about the Secret Service and the number of them that have gotten sick, for VIP protection. And the last is, and I want to get into this in a second because I want to talk a little bit about sort of how I got into this world, is if strength in the national security arena is the projection of competency and capability of dealing with a crisis, we're not showing it right now, right? I mean, in other words, oh, America can get stuff done. Look at us. I mean, we are the worst in the world. We are 250,000 dead. We've got a dysfunctional political arena. We've got states that are or we've got state leadership that is, viewing masking as sort of a political thing rather than a public health thing. We've got, we just got the lack of, I think of the lack of an ability to respond as a projection of our strength. And so to the extent that we want to exert, even if it's a mythology of strength, it's very hard to get past that now. And so that's where I just want to lay that out at the front end, because I want to have a conversation about sort of what happens next. But I next wanted to just quickly just tell you a little bit about sort of how is a Homeland Security, or why is a Homeland Security person in this space, and why do I think about Homeland Security in terms of national security. For those of you interested in the field, I know this is a sort of effort in foreign policy and the more traditional elements of national security, statecraft, war, intelligence. Homeland security is often the forgotten child of that. Part of that is its legacy of sort of coming out of 9/11 and not really being able to define itself outside of the counterterrorism world, which it does include a variety of hazards that we're dealing with: cybersecurity and health security and climate change. But it was also viewed by the national security and foreign policy establishment within the academy, in government, as sort of, as intellectually vigorous as, like, a TSA agent looking at your carry-on luggage. It didn't have any intellectual rigor, I guess I would say, behind it. It wasn't viewed as sort of being at the table. So that when these conversations about national security and foreign policy are going on, Homeland Security was often not part of that. And there's a variety of reasons why that is true. I mean, part of it is just a lack of understanding of what public health threats are, right? I mean, what I just went through, like the different ways in which they impact our potential for undermining our national security. I think their infrequency, although we anticipate there being more also, also has meant that it hasn't been sort of part of a dialogue. I know we all feel like that's all we talk about now, which is probably what we should only be talking about. But you sort of have these blips of H1N1 and Ebola, which really was not like this. You have all these different blips, but they're sort of infrequent. And when they are frequent, they seem like they're far away. The other reason is that, because of their unpredictability, they're much like climate change, where you sort of feel like you can deal with each sort of threat as it comes around, but there's no need to sort of look at it holistically. And I think the other reason why is because when we think about military, military as an apparatus of national security or foreign policy, or diplomacy as an apparatus, there's equivalents in other countries, right? I mean, in other words, it's military to military liaison, or it's the ambassador to the ambassador. The threat of health security and a health security apparatus can vary very much from nation to nation, but depending on the strength of the existing systems and policies that they have. So just like it's very interdisciplinary. It's a very different sort of more touchy-feely. It's very locally based. So when you think about military or diplomacy, it's like centralized, like, this is like, every doctor in every city is sort of, the equivalent of a defense secretary, right? I mean, in other words, it's so tactical that the ability to get nations to communicate sort of outside of the World Health Organization has been very difficult. So I just wanted to lay that out before we get into the bigger discussion about what's next. And then I want to open it up or ask questions and then see where you all are. So where are we and what's next? So the nice thing, so I do a lot in crisis management. That's been sort of my background. I was teaching crisis management in the spring of 2020. I first heard of COVID. I looked back at one stage. I'm a big Twitter person, at Juliette Kayyem, follow me, but I'm a big Twitter person. That's my platform when I'm not on air or writing. And my first tweet was January 3rd. So this was something that even, and it was based on a Wall Street Journal article and a Stat News. For those of you who don't know about Stat News, STATNEWS, it's probably the best, most reliable health security media platform for lay people. In other words, it's writing for you and me. So it's like not, it's like not like the Journal of Medicine or something like that. And they did an article that I just refound yesterday at this horrible 250,000 milestone. They just their story on January 3rd, 2020 was entitled "Mysterious Disease Worries Chinese Officials." Right. And it talked about the disease. It was almost, we actually knew a lot then. I mean, in terms of its respiratory nature, it was harming, it was in Wuhan, it was harming elderly people more. But there was something about it that seemed a little bit off. And that was the disjoint between what China was telling the world, which was that there was no fatalities, and them asking the World Health Organization in. That seemed inconsistent. Why, if China's having a respiratory disease that's not killing anyone, why are you calling in the WHO? So we know how the story was written, right? I mean, and we know what happens next. From January to March, as people like me are screaming into the abyss, right? And I'm doing this from my experience with H1N1, I was part of the leadership team, but also as a Homeland security person who's looking at threats facing the homeland. January through March are what will be called the squandered months. I mean, and when the books are written, these are when we saw something forming. This is the time period that Bob Woodward has written about. Trump is minimizing the threat. We're not preparing state and locals for testing or tracing. We have not built up our supply chain. We're not preparing all of you, right? So my guess is that most of you had heard about COVID sometime in February, late February, but it wasn't until the MBA, if there's a moment in American consciousness when this becomes real, because we don't have a triggering moment from the White House at any moment. It's of course when the NBA closed down for the year. Remember that Saturday night, the same Saturday night, NBA shuts down for the entire season because the NBA had because it plays internationally, has an intelligence presence in a lot of countries. So whatever's there, so it's very interesting, whatever their intelligence network is telling them, they shut down. That was the same night that Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson, for those of you of a certain generation, they matter. I think younger people don't know them as well, that they both said that they had it. And that was sort of an American consciousness moment. And we just saw, to be fair and not too political, I mean, just sort of a non-centralized response. I call it the Articles of Confederation response, which is each state on their own, no invocation of the Defense Production Act, all the tools that we might have wanted to use to treat this like a war, right? I mean, in other words, get us ready. And we've been in that period and disjointed also in terms of how governors are responding. We've been in that period a long time, and we're still in it. As Peter said, are we in the third loop of the first wave or the third wave? We've been in this. We're in response right now. There's just no question about it. And we are locking back down. New York City schools closed. We're telling you all to not do Thanksgiving outside your home. Those that you're already with your home with, I can't. While some states are encountering super spreader events, most of the data suggests that in states like mine, Massachusetts, that the transmission is occurring because people have it in their head that COVID doesn't discriminates by gene pools, right? So it's these intimate gatherings that you think, oh, my brother-in-law and sister are going to come over and we've known them forever and they said they're being careful, right? These are the things that are killing us. But now let's talk about the road ahead. So you got to get your head around 2021. A vaccine never saved a life. Only a vaccination has. So I am thrilled by the news of vaccines. Absolutely thrilled. It's just a testament to, if you just put your head around something, Americans can actually do a lot and private industry can do a lot. We now have to distribute it. So any realistic distribution plan, which is going to go from identification to mass production to distribution to then to monitoring. For young people watching, we will have immunization cards. You will probably be required to carry them to access movie theaters, anything from movie theaters to airline travel. This will be part of the identification. The general public, so the way it's going to flow for this, so this is how to think about 2021. The first wave of vaccinations will go to the people who deserve it, the healthcare community. We've asked, and people who got the placebo in the vaccine, which I think is absolutely right? The people volunteer to get the vaccine and get exposure, but they got a placebo. Half of the people in these large vaccine trials. So that will be first. That's really easy. Second will be military first responders, sort of people in the supply chain, essential workers, people who keep the trains literally running in the United States. And then it gets funky. And we are waiting for the CDC to determine what those priorities are. It'll probably be people with preconditions over 65. There's a debate about whether the next round should be people with comorbidity. In other words, people in which the vaccine will lower the fatality rate, because if you can do that, that means fewer people in the hospital. And that's our goal here, to flatten the curve, to continue to flatten the curve. There's a serious debates about, does the next wave be the younger people who are transmitting more because you all like to go out and party? I think once we make those decisions, this is all in waves. The vaccine will not be distributed like the H1N1 vaccine. It's not going to be per population. It's going to be weighted because our populations are, depending on the criteria, our populations are not weighted the same. There are younger states and older states and healthier states and not healthier states. And so basically think about the general population, which many of us will fall into, under 65, no preconditions. You're really looking at August, September as your time period. It could come faster. I don't think it will be much later. So you're really looking at around, and Fauci is honest about this, around and through 2021, right? In other words, it's going to be in waves. There's going to be ethical debates. The Biden people will probably not change it much. They're probably going to change distribution more than they're going to change the criteria protocols. So that means that for an entire more year plus 1 month plus December, we're going to be in what's called adaptive recovery. In other words, we're right now in response. We have a hell of a 3 months ahead. And I don't get, I've been in crisis management a long time. My temperature does not, my heartbeat tends to remain the same. I'm nervous, right? Because we don't have an epicenter right now. It's not like it's New York as it was in March or the Sun Belt as it was in the early summer or summer. It is now everywhere. We have a 50-state disaster of which we've got a transition that's hardly a transition right now. And we've got and then we've got a vaccine distribution. So we got a lot going on in the next 3 months. Hope springs eternal. I think that the transition will eventually occur relatively soon, hopefully, because we don't want to delay on vaccine distribution. We really don't. I mean, it's the only path forward. So that's 2021. So when I say adaptive recovery, I mean, things will get better. I don't want you all to walk off a cliff. This is really hard. And for young people, a lot of you live alone, or, I have a daughter who left college because of this. I mean, it's just like this freaking interrupted year, it's just, and for older people, you've got, someone like me, you've got your parents, you're worried about your kids, you're worried about, I mean, your peers are passing away. It's grim, but things will get better for a variety of reasons. One is it will be spring. So one is we don't control. One is it will be spring. Two is I do think that this is a huge wake-up call. Since Biden has become president, 5 Republican governors went from never to now on masking. So I think if you can get masking out of the political arena and back into what's smart for the American public, you are now seeing the red states were sort of the holdouts on masking, and I don't do blame. I mean, it's never too late, right? So we want every governor who's willing to do it. You'll see more mandatory mask requirements or rules coming from the federal government when the team takes over. That will include federally regulated industries like airline, transportation, access to parks, just a sort of a carrot and stick approach to getting as close to mandatory masking as you can while you get the vaccine to everyone. So we're going to have a combination of both the public health stuff with the vaccination stuff. And then what happens at the end of this? So let's then now, and so adaptive recovery is we're just going to be dancing around the virus while some people are getting vaccinated and others are wearing masks. And it's going to be a really funky year, but it's better because we're smarter. We know how to live better. We know how to decrease contact intensity. We know how to keep kids in school. Hopefully, we have better treatment, better testing. Hope springs eternal, but it will be better than 2020. And certainly because of the vaccine. So then how do we prepare for what's next? So when people say, well, when we back to normal, I was like, I don't want to go back to normal because 250,000 people, we got to learn from what happened to this disaster. So some things to think about. I think public health will be more fully integrated into the national security foreign policy dynamic. And how can it not when you look at the global recession and the global trade and travel aspects? And how how public health is so closely aligned to our economy. I think on a country by country basis, important questions about healthcare and healthcare equity. And it's not just our country that is dealing with this. Many countries are dealing with the access to healthcare and the impact of COVID on minority and communities of color is greater. And there's an interesting sidebar, if you want to look it up, but how the tribal population actually has done pretty well in certain areas, Indian country, because of their own leadership, that they had very sort of science-based leadership within their own government structure. I'm thinking about women and how this is a women's recession and what to plan for in terms of that. It's a women's recession because women tend to be represented in the service industries. They also tend to be represented in state and local governments, which have been heavily impacted by the recession. Third, they also are impacted, no matter how progressive our partners are, they are impacted, working mothers, by kids being home. So we've seen about 12% of the female population leave voluntarily the workforce because our kids are home. So what we need to start to think about schools as being critical infrastructure. So something to think about. And we will get better with identification and transparency of the next wave. So China, as I said, unforgivable what China did. I'm not, just because they mastered the response because they're able to. It is likely that the first cases were actually in November of 2019. That's what we think looking back. We need a better, more transparent, more transparency by countries. We need to incentivize them to be more transparent, and we need a more engaged and ready to be critical WHO. The WHO has generally wanted to work in cooperation with nations. So we saw that early on. I think that this has shown that you just simply cannot wait. If there's anything that we've learned from different leadership, right? There's discussions about female leadership and about, the next COVID, we should have women leaders because New Zealand and Germany and others did relatively well. That's for someone who studies gender leadership. I'll tell you what I do know. The capacity to make the only wrong decision with a pandemic is a late one. In other words, the ability to make this and to enforce decisions with imperfect information ended up being the thing that saved nations or cities or states over others in terms of their fatality rate. So that's how I see the world sort of unfolding for the next one. We'll get better in terms of planning because we had plans. We have laws that help a president prepare us for supply chain challenges like the Defense Production Act, which will also be invoked very likely early on in the Biden administration. So that's what I'm sort of anticipating in the sort of adaptive 2021. So if 2020 was just crappy by all accounts, 2021 is going to be more adaptive. We will, I don't use the term social distancing anymore. I like to use the term smart distancing because I think we've learned more about the virus. We can engage in ways, whether it's shopping or outdoor walking, or, we know how to do contact intensity. We know how to fly in airplanes now better. We know how to put kids in school. I think New York, I'm not in agreement with New York's decision. There's just not strong evidence that our kids in K through 8 are heavy transmitters. And so that's sort of how to think about the end of 2020, the dark before the light, a funky light through 2021. And then on the other side of that, a nation able to re-engage with other nations in other national security and foreign policy priorities. Oh, I talked a long time, but I'm happy to now talk through, how we get through it or what's next, but thank you.
Thanks, Juliette. That was really an interesting rundown, and we'll open it up to the floor. If you're interested, just go ahead and turn on your camera and speak up. Try not to step on each other, but I'll take the first crack. And what I want to talk about is the Biden administration is likely to re-enter the World Health Organization. And yet the World Health Organization wasn't critical of China and its lack of transparency regarding the virus. So what sort of conditions should the Biden administration put on the World Health Organization as a condition for the United States re-entering? Because of course we bring with us a big checkbook, which they would like. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So I think that is going to be, so the WHO will have its own lessons learned. And part of that is its complete, acquiescence, I think is wrong, but its complete sort of cooperative nature about what's happening in a country. In other words, the WHO will not declare a pandemic in another country unless that country declares it itself. So this is like, okay, and this is the China problem, right? In other words, and that definition or that triggering then leads to all sorts of, other tools that the WHO can use. In particular, and this comes to the second point, is travel restrictions, highly controversial. As I said, if they happen, they have to happen early. We were probably too late, and it was probably a little bit too disjointed here in the U.S. I think we have to talk more seriously about travel restrictions. I think it's whether you isolate a country or you isolate an area. And then the other conditions that I would do is this. Here's a condition that I would put on any country that puts in more than 2 or 3%. So smaller countries would not have this authority, but we would have access to WHO's, basically intelligence apparatus, so that we could individually know what is in fact going on in a country. So, part of the problem with the WHO had less to do with like, did we know stuff was going on, and probably more to do with, were we responding to what WHO was telling us, which, they were telling us in January and February. But I do think that those are ways that we can condition our reentry, but we'll reenter immediately. And we should, because this is a global, we're not normal as a country until we get, a couple billion people vaccinated.
Okay. Any thoughts from the crowd here?
Yeah, hi, Elizabeth. I'm gonna just turn on my lights. It got so dark. I hate daylight savings. Hold on a second.
Elizabeth, you go ahead and ask your question.
We'll go Elizabeth and then Jerry. And I tell you what, if you want to speak up, just put your name in the chat.
Yeah.
I'll call on people that way. So Elizabeth and then Jerry.
Yeah, my question is, so I know masks are required in most states and most places now. Yeah. And I'm just curious, like, even after everybody gets vaccinated here in the next few months and years going forward, do you think mask wearing will just become a normal thing for years to come?
I do. I do a lot of private consulting. And I just was on with I was just on a phone call right before this with a CEO of a major movie chain. Who's lost 95%. I mean, can you imagine going back to a movie theater now? And I'm very cautious. So I actually haven't been back on a plane since March. I'm 51, you're younger. I'm 51. I'm healthy. I think if I got it, I'd be fine. I'm worried about 70-year-old me and what this is going to do to my lungs, if I get it, right? This is the thing we don't know is for middle-aged people. So I think that's exactly right. I think that there will be a entire public health apparatus that continues after the vaccine. And then so what he was telling me is cleanliness. He used to worry about active shooters. Cleanliness has now become health. His security issue now is health security. And one dynamic I've seen in a lot of big corporations, from Google to movie chains to, of course, the cruise lines, which will die if we don't get this right, is the rise of the chief health officer. We used to have chief security officers after 9/11. Now we're having the chief health officer that can help these organizations. So I don't know if they'll be mandatory, but I think in the way that if you ever traveled to Asia before and you just got used to, some percentage of the population masked, I think that will be true here. There might be industries that require it. I can't imagine being on an airplane without a mask for the foreseeable future. I mean, it might be PTSD on my part or whatever. I took my last plane March 5th from San Francisco, where it was already, and I'm, I don't plan on being on a plane within the year. I can't imagine I'm on a plane January. And if I were on a plane once vaccinated, once we had herd immunity, say late 2021, I can't imagine it. I said, I think people will be making those decisions. I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay, Jerry.
Yeah, Juliette, it's Jerry Hudson here.
Hi.
Hi. You mentioned PTSD. I was going to ask another question, but the PTSD sort of tweaked a a thought I had when I was reading your article here about kind of the mental strain issues that maybe we're not thinking about now, but which are long-term effects of this pandemic. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what kinds of programs and policies could be put in place at the national level to help out with what are likely to be a lot of people with mental illness.
Yeah. No, it is. So there's almost no mental health parts to the stimulus. So we need to get a stimulus. I mean, we're at the basics now in terms of unemployment and stimulus and what's happening in in every hometown and city in America. But I think the long-term, both for healthcare workers, the long-term impact is it's war, it's trauma. If you have anyone in your family who is working this and their families, right? So I have friends whose husbands or spouses actually are doctors, and you know, the spouse sleeps downstairs in the basement because they have, you know, 2 kids and, you know, whatever. So there's not enough focus on that, but I do think that the long-term impact would be great. What we're seeing in terms of response planning, because that's what I do, is one of the interesting dynamics of how long-term this is. An interesting, is a generic way of putting it, is while in the early days, the greater stress tended to be on people with kids. So employers were seeing lots of stress of people with kids at home, right? We've kind of gotten used to it. I think it's because of neglect. You know, I mean, we've gotten used to neglecting our kids, is how I put it, right? So we're not the the isolation of elderly living alone who can't see their families, or 20 somethings. The suicide rate in 20 somethings is high, right? Is starting to tick up, right? Because one is the isolation, 2 is what the hell's my future like? This is the conversation I have with my college age kid, you know, like thanks, you know. And so you have to be, you know, we're monitoring that as well, but you're exactly right.
50% of 20-year-olds are living with their parents.
Yeah.
Including my 26-year-old son, who was in the music industry, which collapsed, of course, given COVID.
Right.
John Mueller.
Hi, let me ask you about something you talked about earlier on, which is perceptions of competence.
Yeah.
It seems the issue here is going to be a big one, which is between China and the United States, in which China looks incredibly competent to a lot of people outside this country.
Yes.
And the United States looks incredibly incompetent, coming on top of disastrous failed wars in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah.
The United States can blame it on China, as you and Trump and Pete seem to want to do, and you may even be right. But that's going to look like incredible sour grapes.
Yeah.
Given the death rates that are in China, however they lied, the number of people that died there, even if they're lying about that, is likely to be vastly smaller in the United States. So the issue is basically, the key thing you talked about is perceptions of competence. It looks like the United States is taking it on the chin.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is. And if I was unclear about that, I divide the the December, January. My blame of China isn't, we blame them for the virus that happens in countries, was the lack of transparency early. I mean, they basically thought they could handle this on their own. And then when they couldn't, that's when they started to call in folks. So I don't even think about China anymore in terms of our response is our own, because we were getting notification in January. So when the WHO was called in January 3rd, that I, with no access to intelligence anymore, start to worry about it in January. Where is my, honestly, where is my government? And so I do think that that's exactly right. And so we own this. And in my not as nice moment, I mean, there's reasons why our death rate is, I'm actually quite, having been in federal government and Homeland Security, for people who are interested in this stuff, security is the easy part in the US on Homeland Security. It's the Homeland part that's hard because of the governance issue, right? We're not China. We're not, you just can't, it would be very hard to lock down an entire state without force, in the United States. Or without lots of court cases, as we've seen. So the governance challenge would have made almost any response difficult. I think it's more likely than not under any administration, we probably would have had communities, 50 state communities.
Excuse me, the question is not about, the question is how are other people going to look at it?
No, that's what I'm saying. I think that
They look like the United States is a huge loser.
Yep, that's
China
exactly
is
right.
a real winner. So it's a
I
real-
don't disagree, right? And we don't get that back, right? I mean, we don't get. I mean, it's Hurricane Katrina on steroids, and we don't get that. I mean, that's a global Hurricane Katrina. I agree with you.
On the other hand, the two most promising vaccines right now are being created by American
Right.
companies. So there is that we still have this enormous capacity in the United States to at least deal with the fallout. Rick Herman.
Thank you for such an interesting talk.
Thank you.
I have, I guess, two questions, and they're sort of related, and they have to do with conflict. My son is the director of clinical operations at one of the big city hospitals here in Columbus. And they currently are getting close to maximum capacity. And they haven't faced that since last spring. Now, currently there aren't shortages.
Right.
But when there were shortages, we didn't see very much international cooperation. In fact, we saw everyone on their own. And we didn't see much cooperation across states. So as this vaccine rolls out, let's say we make it to January without massive crisis between now and then, which is a big assumption, I'm worrying. But let's say we do. When this vaccine rolls out, what are we prepared to do in terms of international cooperation? Pete mentioned Pfizer and Moderna are American, but they may sell it to the Chinese or the Germans or the French. These are international companies. So where are we on that? And then second, there has been no national coordinated plan, the best I can tell. Will the vaccine roll out at a national plan, or will Ohio compete with Indiana and Pennsylvania to get their share? And then the governor of Ohio decide how it goes, and then the governor of Nevada decides how it goes there, and so on and so forth. So I guess it's the conflict at two different levels, international and domestic. If we get into scarcity, which we certainly will with the vaccine, and we might even before then.
Yeah, so it's true. And first, thank your son for everything he's doing. And obviously you're seeing military capacity being built in some of these states just to be able to take extra folks. And I mean, it's a testament to our healthcare system that has not crashed yet. And that, you know, but the everything I read tells me, you know, we could surge resources, we can surge beds, we can figure that stuff out. Our floor is our healthcare workers who are spent. And yeah, I mean, that is, okay, let me just answer both questions. So both Moderna and Pfizer, thank you, do have deals with most other nations or unions, the African Union, whatever. I mean, this is not manufacturing deals. Those countries will have to manufacture. I mean, those entities will have to manufacture on their own. So when you think like for Moderna, I remember there was this question about whether they got money from Operation Warp Speed. Remember there was like this debate, like did Trump support them or not? Actually, what most companies did, Pfizer's different, is most countries did advance purchase orders. In other words, they gave these companies money, or I'm sorry, they did not give these companies money for development. They said, you find the vaccine, but and you manufacture it, you know, through a third party or whatever. And if it works, we'll create the market. So many countries will benefit from what we've done. And that's the expectation, because our limitation is manufacturing. So we should disperse that globally. It shouldn't be on all of us to satisfy the world. So I'm pretty optimistic. And then there's some Chinese vaccines that I don't know the exact details of. Apparently Putin has one that's perfect, but we'll let him take that one. On the competition amongst states, I think that's why this is going to be heavily regulated at this stage. I don't think you're going to see the competition. And that is, you know, we're waiting for the CDC's guidelines. They will follow, hopefully, equitable distribution, not by population, but by need. What that need is, we might have serious debates, but this is, you know, this is the kind of thing that I had worked on, which is what are your distribution protocols? And as long as you're transparent States tend to be okay because it's rolling, as long as you're transparent, as long as they understand what's coming when, and then they are transparent with their populations. And each state is going to, you'll hear a lot about the military. The military is great with bulk. Each state is going to have to figure out what's called the last mile, right? So the military can bring this stuff in and bring all the ancillary stuff. You know, are we going to do it at schools, community health centers and stuff like that? So the good news is that stuff has been being worked since the summer. It's now ripe, so you're going to hear more about it.
Juliette, I have a question. You mentioned the military involved
Yeah.
in distribution. And I don't understand why, because we've
Yeah.
been doing flu shots in this country for, decades.
Yeah.
And the civilian distribution system seems to handle that just fine. So
Yeah.
I don't understand why we need a different distribution.
I'm with you. I've been very critical of it. I think part of it is just sort of a tendency of this administration to sort of, whether it's border enforcement or whatever. I'll tell you why I don't want the military in it. As someone who knows emergency management, we have the capacity to build military capabilities into civilian processes. It's something called the Defense Support of Civilian Authorities, DISCA. You're going to hear it, DSCA. You're going to hear it a lot, which is we can, as a civilian authority, as a say state emergency manager, I can tell either the National Guard or have the National Guard ask the Pentagon, I need a lot of stuff moved quickly, or I need 8 tents, to do vaccination lines or whatever. That's what they're good at. But you want them through a civilian entity. And the reason why is twofold. One, is exactly what you said, which is this is the most intimate of things. The vaccines have not been tested on children. So remember, our kids are not likely to get it until the second wave of testing goes on. So, but in your arm is intimate. There's communities and populations in America that do not have any interaction with the military or even trust of the military. So the other reason why, but we get our doctors. I mean, if you look at the polling, we still love our doctors, right? I mean, and we still get information from our doctors. The other reason why is for the corollary, which is I don't like the military in the middle of, to the point that Rick was suggesting, this will be highly political. I think we can deal with it with transparency and stuff, political with a little p. The last thing you want is our military in the middle of, what is inevitably going to be politics with a little p about, what groups are first or who is considered a community, a member of a certain community. And so, that's just not something you want the military in the middle of.
Yeah, the conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
If you have a question or you want to comment, please put your name in the chat. I will just continue here if you
want. Come on, folks.
And that is, so I've read an article using history as a basis on how the Austro-Hungarian Empire basically handled pandemics in days of old. We're talking like the Middle Ages and the early modern Europe. And they basically created a wall around the empire. And if you came in from outside, you were quarantined.
Yeah.
So the question is, with modern testing technologies and so forth, do you foresee a future in which maybe travelers to the United States are tested at airports and ports of entries for known contagions?
Yes, I absolutely do. And I think you're starting, one airline has already announced that they will be doing pre-testing and they're going to try that as a pilot. We can, as an American, we can't travel most places, but if you're allowed to travel to those places because you're, the government has an exception for you. So there'll be, reasons to be able to travel. You are having those tests already, but I do think that that's exactly right. I think public health, global health will become the equivalent of the search for, after 9/11, the entire global aviation security network raised the floor so that your experience at all airports, and it's been refined, is relatively the same. Some are better than others, trust me, I know. But they're basically, they're testing for the same things because, and I think that will be true of public health now.
I could see being tested for just, temperature monitors
Yep.
and whatnot. And I'm sorry, you got a fever, you're
Quarantine,
off.
right.
Yeah.
Juliette,
Joe Steve.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much, Juliette. I've really enjoyed this. And
you.
a couple people have referred to the problem or the issue of vaccination, and I kind of wanted to ask about the anti-vaxxer movement, right?
Yes.
And so if, let's say you had maybe 5 to 10% of the population that was skeptical of getting a vaccine, right? I actually have no idea what that percentage would be.
Yeah.
Can they mess the whole thing up? That's my first question. And the second question is, what kind of legal recourse is there to compel people in that regard? And I think, my second part, or on that second point, I'm particularly interested in what recourse employers have.
Yes. So such a great question. Okay. So the polling right now is really bad. So we call it vaccine hesitation or COVID vaccine hesitation. It's really bad. But I think all of that gets thrown out the window, not because it's a new day with Biden, but because I think once you have a vaccine, once you start to disclose what the standards are, I mean, and once you take it out of the politics, which I think Biden will be better about than Trump, just given their personalities more than anything, I think that data is going to change. But the numbers right now are horrific. 50% of Americans are vaccine skeptics. And then it's really bad with communities of color, Hispanic, African-American communities. So I'm inclined to throw all that polling out the window. Let's do it in January and February when we have a sense. So one is vaccine hesitancy is a nice way to put it. But it is part of a disinformation campaign by the Russians right now. They are definitely playing into the anti-vax movement, which is very strong in the United States. So there's a whole network that's doing this. So what's a recourse for in a country that does, that is, never had a forced vaccination program? And it's also inconsistent with the way public health thinks about things. They really don't like compulsory vaccination. I mean, so why do we vaccinate our kids now? Is it because the federal government told us so? No. I mean, one is because we follow science, and the other is because our kids can't do certain things, i.e. enter public school, without proof of vaccination. So I think what you're going to see is a carrot stick approach, which is you're going to incentivize people to do it through ad campaigns, through, it's not me that's going to convince people, but it's Beyonce, or it's, I don't know if you all remember on the, someone give me the right date. Is it the polio vaccination? That compliance was really low in under 30-year-olds. Yeah, it would have been polio. And Elvis Presley got a shot on national television live, and the numbers just went like that. So we need people. Elvis Presley's dead, now I'm dead, but we need the Instagram influencers, the people that I don't know that are going to influence different communities, the Beyoncés and whatever. And so there's actually a campaign to do that, and it's a modern day. Elvis was on Ed Sullivan. He had the shot on Ed Sullivan, and it just changed the dynamics. I mean, it just in terms of it. So, and then finally on the last part, which is the stick part, it'd be very hard to enforce a national standard. I think what you're going to see Biden do, a national compulsory vaccination. I just think you're going to see anything with a federal nexus will require the vaccination, and any entity that receives federal funds will be required that their constituency be vaccinated. So I think that's how we're going to get school kids, right? In other words, or school or parents, right? The other is employers. They are key to this. It is unfair to the other employees to have, a certain population unwilling to take it. So there is a strong outreach to employers as well. There was a great piece in the Wall Street Journal called, CEOs, you're part of this, right? That the way drug testing used to be or whatever, they're gonna demand it. So I think through that hodgepodge, you'll get close to compulsory without calling it compulsory.
I hate to say it, but the biggest influencer that needs to take a shot on national TV is Donald Trump.
Yeah, it is. I have to say one thing. I mean, I think that the fact that, I don't, in my world, I don't do blame, I don't do, whatever. I just move forward. I'm very happy these Republican governors have shifted. I think it's never too late on masking.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's not a coincidence that happened after the election, when masking can no longer be viewed as a loyalty or a litmus test to the White House. I do think it cannot be a coincidence that everywhere from West Virginia to North Dakota, which is the one, Christy knows, the one where she's not the governor, she has not shifted yet. And then other states have gotten tougher, Iowa and others with Republicans.
I don't think it would be impossible to get Donald Trump to take a vaccination if you credit Operation Warp Speed and give him some credit for enacting that. And you never know. He may want to glom onto that and stay in the limelight and take credit for the vaccination. Two things about the polling. One, it was against a generic vaccine and not a specific vaccines, which have now been shown to be 95% effective. And so that might get more people to take it. And the other thing is you weren't into this third wave, which is hitting families hard.
Yeah.
And people, this is a generic threat until one of their family members dies. And then all of a sudden, oh, give me a vaccine, right? So we may see the numbers to be a little higher than
I think that's right.
I hope we see the numbers to be a little higher.
Right.
Jerry, another question from you. And we'll take maybe one more. You're muted, and we'll take maybe one more after this.
That'd be great. Yeah, because I got a 5 o'clock. I'll tell them to hold off for 1 second, but yeah.
Okay, well then we'll make this the last.
No,
one.
yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, if no one else wants to get on, I do have my original question was, you have sounded very optimistic about the path ahead. I mean, generally speaking, and in fact, a lot of the comments, we're all looking forward, and I find that very heartening. But my question is, how are we going to get through the next 3 months?
Yeah.
With a president who is, not his administration seems to be doing nothing to help out, and so he's just reinforcing people's attitudes.
Only 2 months, Jerry.
How are we going to?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a state by state defense, city by city. I was pleased that Biden met with a bipartisan group of governors, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. Governors are they may be we talk about the outliers, but for the most part, they are, I'll tell you what's happening. Their hospital CEOs, their fancy medical communities are calling them and saying, we have a problem. And so whatever animates them, if it's not, part of it is, I think that they're seeing what's happening in their states. I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
Juliette.
Thank you. Good luck. Just stay home 3 months and then there's light at the end. I promise.
We really appreciate you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I've got my office hours because I'm teaching, and because of it's online, much like you do, 4 o'clock is a weird time. I have to do office hours at like 7 in the morning and 5 at night because of students that stayed in Asia and Europe, and now this is the West Coast office hours.
All right. Well, feel free to drop off whenever you want.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one. Good luck.
Yeah, thanks again. For the Mershon community, our next event will be on December 3rd. It's on the legacy and thought of Brent Scowcroft, who died recently, 4 to 5 p.m. And then looking forward to next semester, we're going to begin in January, hopefully with Jeff Trimble, who's at Ohio State, talking about the voice of America and the future of information operations and in a world of disinformation, which I think will be pretty interesting. And that's at a date to be determined. But on February 4th, 3:30 to 5, for sure, we're going to have Nadia Shadlow who will give a speech, 45-minute presentation, followed by Q&A on the development of the 2017 National Security Strategy. She was the lead author for that under H.R. McMaster's National Security Council. So please put that on your calendar. And with that, thank you for attending.